In this video, we're going to be comparing the new Sony VPL-VW385ES, and by turning off the iris, we'll simulate the 285. That's the key difference besides the lens memory. And the Optoma UHZ65, which is a laser light engine. So we're actually looking at a lamp-based projector versus a laser projector, as well as a 3-chip versus a 1-chip DLP 4K UHD projector. So with that, we'll get started. So for the purposes of this video, we are first going to start with color, and I'll mention that what you are looking at is a Stewart Studio Tech 130. It's a reference screen, has a gain of 1.3. This is a variable aspect version of it, and we're in 235:1, so we can fit as much of each of the 16:9 images that we're displaying right now. We'll start over here on the Sony. We're in Cinema Film 1, and the Cinema Black Pro is where you set, one of the places you can set the lamp control. And we've also got the iris set to full, and when we get to the contrast, we'll play around with that so you can see the difference between the 385 and the 285. But going back to our basic settings, the contrast from a Sony is on professional projectors usually at 80. On most of their home theater, it's out of the box at 99. They're giving you all of the contrast, and the other settings are set to that. Brightness, we noticed that was a little bit low in the Sony, so when this was calibrated, it came up to 54. Color was a little bit high. That was turned down to 44. Hue was pretty much dead on. We're at D6500. And in expert setting, one thing that we found is the clear white affects the white point. So we use the temperature sensor of the calibration equipment and set that to low so we could hit 6500 within a very few degrees. On the right side, and during these videos, the Optoma will always be on the right. We'll take you into the image settings. We put it in the cinema mode, and that is a good balance between good brightness and good color. Reference mode on both the Sony and this one are a little bit dimmer, but you really, you might as well take advantage of some of the brightness you can get, unless you don't need it. If you're using a small screen and you don't need it, you certainly can put them in reference. But both of these are in the cinema mode. And brightness to do the calibration was at a -2, contrast a -1, and sharpness at 11. If we go up into the secondary menus, we'll get into this a little bit more when we compare brightness, but we're at 50% in Dynamic Black 3, and we're using Ultra Detail 1, and in color settings we have Brilliant Color set for 8 in this setting. So with that in mind, let's take a look at some of the color. We're first going to look at some test slides. These are from the Infocom shootout when they used to do shootouts. You can compare the two. Again, they are different, but you will see some strengths and weaknesses on both sides, which is usually the case with a projector. So this next image is a canyon, and again, we found that the camera itself that we used last time, its infrared cut filter, let's get to some color, here we go, and we're going to hold it here and talk about that a little bit more. But the infrared cut filter was affecting our blues. We weren't seeing it with our eyes. We didn't understand why we were seeing it in the video. So we experimented a little bit more, and it seems to do, because we took some IR filters and played with it, but we're using a different camera this time, one that seems to be naturally able to reproduce the colors more what our eye sees. So you'll notice the purples, the oranges, the yellows are very, very close. We're going to take a look now at a couple more skin tones, and then we're going to do some motion skin tones. But first we're going to take a look. Here's a color slide that has very vibrant, bright colors on it. You'll notice that even though the Optoma is using a DLP chip, because they are using a very accurate laser. Lasers are generally able to deliver a little more pure light because they start with a blue laser. They hit a phosphor that is designed to produce accurate white. That's going to give you a good 6500 degrees. So now we're seeing out of both these projectors very good yellows. This is definitely an improvement over the D65. The yellows are a little more vibrant. Our whites are still good, our greens are spectacular, and the blues are really amazing, as you'll see in some of these upcoming pictures. I'm going to quickly go through a couple more of these, but I really want to look at skin tone, because in the skin tone you'll be able to see differences that we're seeing. For example, this one. This is a very tough skin tone to reproduce because it's right on the edge of being a little bit on the kind of the green sick feel versus what's kind of warm. And you'll see these handled a little bit differently. In both cases, it's a good usable picture. And then there's one more I want to take a look at up here, right here. So we're going to hold it on here for just a second. You'll see the differences this time in the greens, and it's usually reversed of what we see. And one of the things that we'll talk about in this video is that each projector has its own differences in color, contrast, and its ability to handle different scenes. And one of the reasons we're seeing so many differences in different reviews is what you're seeing right here. A minute ago, we were seeing a very different green on the Optoma on the right. Now we're seeing a green on the left that's different than that on the right, and yet the background colors, for all intents and purposes, are very, very close. If you look on the right side of his elbow in both pictures, it's a very close green, but in his shirt it's somewhat different, and it will be affected by what kind of monitor you look at as well. Now we're going to look at some color in 4K, and I've got the menus up on both. We're both in 2.2 gamma, and on the Optoma we've got the pure engine off, so we're not overly enhancing the color or the contrast. And we're going to turn both these menus off now, and then we're going to start the footage rolling and talk about it a little bit as it plays. Because the difference is what we're seeing on our monitor here, and hopefully on the version that is presented in 4K on the web, you will be able to see the same differences here. And those main differences, you'll see it in blue. The laser light source has a very different blue than the lamp-based, even though the color temperature is the same. You'll also see some differences in the greens. It's a different type of green, and a little bit in the yellows. There's some of that sky again. It's a deeper, darker blue on the laser. It's hard to know, how accurate, which one is more accurate. I mean, I've seen skies on both sides that look like that, but we don't have a real reference. We'll show you, as we looked at those other test slides, the color in there. Here's another one with a lot of blue. It's got your yellows, it's got some of the greens, and here we're seeing those deep turquoises. Those are some of the more difficult colors. This 4K footage is not high dynamic range. Again, we are comparing the two. So now we're going to take a look at some color differences on a 4K Blu-ray disc. So this is playing on the Oppo 203, and we're going to start out with a scene that has a lot of yellow and blues, since that's where we're seeing most of the differences between the laser light color and the lamp-based projector. So take a look. We're going to roll this footage, and we're going to go inside where there's mostly blues and yellows. And there are very differences that we're seeing both with our eyes and also on the monitor, so you should be able to see this. It's not saying that one is better than the other. They are just very different. The yellows are a different tone, and in some of these scenes you'll see the skin tones look a different tone. Not just the yellow, but in the actual people that are more normal towards skin tone, or more common towards skin tone as well. So we're going to look at, this is Chapter 7 in Guardians of the Galaxy 2. We're going to be comparing color again. Again, the purpose is to show you the differences. It's not that one is right and the other one's wrong, or one's better than the other, but they are very different. We're trying to show those. So they're both in D6500. We've calibrated them. They're within 10 to 15 degrees of each other in terms of white balance. So we're going to turn the menu off on here, and then we're going to go ahead and start this in play. This scene has got some amazing color in it that takes advantage of the expanded color of both these projectors. And you'll see when the color bubble is popped right here, and we're able to see some of the bright, vivid colors in the scene and how they are dispersed and presented. So again, they're different. They're similar, but they're very different. And what's really interesting is even though the D6500 is within a few degrees, you will notice that in some of the scenes, even something that's very light, like that pod that they're riding on, they're very different. Even though to the measurement of instruments, they're very close, and to the eye, they look very close. With the camera, which is just very, very critical, you can see some of the differences. But most of the differences you're seeing there, from what we can tell on the monitor, are the same differences we're seeing with our eye. So this final scene we're going to look at, or slide, is from test signals on the Spears and Munsell disc. And that's very good for doing basic color setup for both monitors and projectors. Here what we've done is we've gone to the tartan bars and we've flipped the image left to right on the Optoma. This is the Optoma side. This is the Sony side. And we've done that so that you can see side by side the colors between the two. They're both in 6500 degrees. They've been set up so that they're within a few degrees of each other. And here, when you compare the colors, you can see how close they actually are. We're seeing almost no differences between these, including the whites. And that's why it's so interesting when we look at those color scenes that you've just seen, how we're seeing differences in the color. And we attribute that to both the light engines and the light sources. They're just going to be different. There's no way that they're going to be exactly the same, even though with test equipment and calibration, you set them up so that they're very, very close to each other. You're still going to see differences in the scene, and you'll continue to see those, even though now we're going to be looking at contrast and detail and resolution. You'll also be seeing that there is still going to be some differences in the color. So with that, we'll conclude this section of the color and we'll move on to the next section. So we're going to start off the contrast portion of this comparison by first looking at zero IRE. So this is if a scene faded to black. And of course, that's one of the advantages of an iris, is it can control this. We've shut the iris off on the left side, which is the Sony 385, because we also want to know what the Sony 285 would do. So that's the level of black, and we've had to turn the camera up to 16,000 ISO to even get it to register. Because on the right, which is the Optoma, the lasers are modulated instead of an iris, and they shut completely off. There is no light on the right side of the screen. So what I'm going to do is we're going to pull up the menu and we're going to show you the difference, and hopefully you'll be able to see this. We're going to go back into Cinema Pro Black, and instead of having the iris off like it is now, we're going to put it on full. Actually, you can see the steps. That's off, so that's a 285, limited or full. And then I'm going to turn this off. So you can see now that the iris has said, oh, we're on a black scene, so it's going to drop it down. That is very, very dark, but it's not the same as going completely to black. But I wanted you to see that because one of the reasons we're seeing so many different things in terms of reviews that talk about the contrast is they're not understanding two important parts. One is how the settings inside the Optoma affect each other, as it does in the Sony that we'll talk about in a minute. But also, it depends on what you're looking at. So if you're at zero IRE, there's no contest. The laser can shut off, as can Sony's, as can Epson's. But if you have some amount of light, which we're going to take a look at next, it becomes very, very different. So right now, that is the difference between the 385 and the UHZ65. And if I turn the iris back off by going into the iris setting, going into limited and then off, that is really the performance difference you're seeing between the 285ES, the Sony, and the 385ES is that iris. And as we mentioned, you also get the lens memory, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. Okay, this is the ANSI test pattern. What we're going to be doing here, we're not so much as interested in measuring ANSI contrast, because both of these projectors, we're really looking more at dynamic contrast. But what we want to do with this pattern, because it has half of it, 50% of it is black and 50% is white, is just do a little comparison between these, because I think you'll be surprised at how close they really are. So when you measure blacks, you have to let the meter settle down just a little bit. It's bouncing now. It's down to 1.1, 1.2. We go here to the white now, and the white is going to take us up to 96.6, 96.5, 97.2. So right in that 96, 97 and the 1.1. So now we'll move over to the Sony, and in the Sony, we are measuring 89, and both of these, the Sony is using its dynamic contrast and its iris, and so is the Optoma. And we're getting 89, and then we're going down into the black, and we're letting that settle down, and the black is 1.0. So the contrast is really the same on 50-50. This is the brights are a little bit less bright, and the blacks are a little bit less bright. Here they're both a little bit brighter, because as you bring your brightness up, so do your blacks. So if you have a scene that has approximately the same brightness, a typical scene, for example, that had bright highlights and dark areas, the contrast is amazingly very close, even though the technology between these two is very, very different. We're going to take a look at 3 different scenes in 4K in this section of our contrast, which are ones you've probably seen before if you've seen some of the other comparison videos. This particular scene is very interesting, because if it's a normal 4K shift, like Epson or JVC or anyone else that is doing a electronic shift, you are actually only delivering about 4 million pixels to the screen, so you won't see all of the stars. Now, the Sony is a true 4K projector, meaning that it's doing 4,096 pixels across. It's even above UHD. And all of the stars are there. But on the Optoma, the stars are brighter. And we don't know if that's because of the dynamic contrast type that they're using, or if it's the size of the pixels, because when we show you the resolution later on, they're both resolving almost identically the same amount of pixels when you're looking at test patterns for 4K. But here you will see the differences in the images. We're going to let this roll for just a minute, and then we'll freeze it so you can take a look at the final contrast ratio on it. They've both got excellent blacks. They both are reproducing all of the stars in both of these scenes. So it's just interesting again to see some of the differences between these. Now we're going to take a look at a couple of night scenes, because these are very good for looking at low level, and everybody wants to know how the black levels compare. When they're both set up properly, they are amazingly close. I cannot say that the contrast, the blacks on one are definitely better than the other one. In a minute we'll show you why you're getting some of the discrepancies by some of the reviewers, because they're not understanding it. Okay, this is a very important scene for understanding why some of the reviews of the Optoma have said it doesn't have a very good black level. And what we have found, depending on the settings on both these projectors, so the Sony is in, this is the 385ES with the iris engaged. It has gorgeous blacks. You can see the HDMI 2 in the top left, and frequency is out of range on the right. Because we wanted something that was mostly black, but with some light information, because if we don't have that light information, the Optoma, because it's laser-based, will go completely black, and therefore its blacks, some manufacturers call it infinite contrast, but we want to know what it can really do in a scene, which is what we've been looking at. But we wanted to show you this, because as long as we have something on the screen, the Optoma, and we understand that they're working on a firmware update. We don't know how much or if any it'll improve this, but if you have a scene that is mostly dark, and again, we looked at the star field, that was not mostly dark. Soon as you get above 10 to 15%, then the contrast ratio gets very, very close, and the blacks are very, very close. But this is why we think several of the reviewers have said, oh, the black levels aren't very good, because you can get this circumstances where they're not, for whatever reason, they are not dimming the lasers, and so you're seeing the full brightness of the lasers, and you're not able to get that black. But as soon as we put some contrast, which we're going to take a look at HDR next, you'll see that it's a whole different ball game. But that's why you're seeing some of them, some of the reviews and some people and all the different opinions, because yes, the Sony has absolutely great blacks as long as there is something on the screen. It can't go completely black, and when you have brightness levels in the image, which we'll look at in a minute, you'll see the contrast is very good, but so is the Optoma. So anyway, this is something that's very important to understand. Okay, in this scene, we're going to be taking a look at the contrast, and specifically HDR contrast, which is more than just contrast. It has to do with dynamic range. So they've both sensed that they're in HDR. We've got the contrast in HDR on the Sony turned up all the way, and we have dynamic black 3 engaged on the Optoma. So let's take a look, and I'll freeze this in a couple places to talk about it. He's looking at a little zoom player here, and you'll see I'm going to pause it right there. I'm hoping that you can see what our eyes are seeing here, which is absolutely amazing. There's been many articles and comments made relative to projectors. Does HDR really even matter? Well, I can tell you that in the case of a 3,000 lumen laser projector, it is absolutely stunning of what it can do in terms of bringing out the detail in the highlights, yet at the same time maintaining the detail in the black levels. It has been said that full HDR is more like a photographer who is able to expose for 12 or 14 stops of information or detail or dynamic range, whereas traditional video or 8-bit, this is 10-bit of course, but 8-bit is generally limited to about 9 stops. So you're moving from about 9 stops to all the way up to as much as 14 stops. And here, I'm hoping you can see this on the video. It looks like on the monitor you can see some of it, but I'm going to play a little of this because it really is amazing the extra oomph that the laser can give you. The Sony's doing an excellent job. You can see the lights in the background, how they punch out, and yet at the same time we're seeing great blacks in the scene. So this is going to go to another scene here in a minute with the rocket who is at the controls. Again, this is Guardians of the Galaxy 2. We're just using as a reference because it has HDR. It was one of the first movies shot with an 8K red camera, so the detail on it is spectacular. It's one of my favorite for evaluation of various products. So we're now going to be moving from the outside. As you see this move in, you'll notice some of the highlights. They should be a little bit brighter. Now this one's coming up right there, and I'm going to point out a couple of things to you, because one of the things you do not want to do with high dynamic range, yes, you want bright highlights, but you don't want to lose the details. And you'll notice in here that we're getting the details of the light source as we are on the Sony. Over here, we're getting some of those details, but there is definitely a difference in the way they handle high dynamic range. And I would have to say that in the case of the laser being a brighter projector, capable of that extra output, you can see some of these highlights as well as the detail in the darks, because if you lose the detail in the darks or you just have a brighter picture, that's not what HDR is all about. HDR is about getting more color information within that wider exposure range, but yes, you are seeing more like the eye sees. You're seeing the very bright parts of the picture at the same time you're seeing the dark parts of a picture. Okay, now we're going to take a look at detail. I'm going to freeze this image, which is a 4K source, and I've reversed the Optoma on the right, so as we zoom in, you're going to be seeing detail in the center. And a couple of areas to look at, and I must say that Sony's done a tremendous job in improving the lens, because the 265, some of them were really good, some of them were not so good, but it really did seem to vary, and I thought it was interesting that they had made improvements on the 285 and the 385. We're looking at the 385 right now, and its focus is definitely improved. So if you look at the fine grid patterns in here as well as the detail here, you should be able to see that they're both now reproducing that grid pattern extremely well. Later on we'll take a look at some of the actual 4K test patterns, but now you can see visually in this scene what's going on. We're going to roll this so you can see detail in motion, and then we're going to freeze it again here. And we're zoomed in so that you can see both of these clocks are amazingly detailed. You can see the detail in the bar tile roof, the detail in the stonework in the towers, and it's amazingly close, much closer than the technology would suggest, being very different. The Sony on the left is using 3 reflective chips, which gives us great contrast, very, very good detail because they are full 4K chips. On the right, we're using UHD DLP technology, but the result is they're both making extremely sharp, detailed pictures. We'll roll this just a little bit to finish up because I think there's a scene coming up here that will have some more detail. You can also see again the fine color differences between them, but you won't have that problem with the purple we had with that IR cut filter in the optics of the previous camera. So this is a much better comparison showing you the differences between them. There are some differences, but again, here we're looking for detail and it's extremely close. Okay, so here we're looking at a test signal, a test pattern in 4K. Again, we've got the Optoma on the right, the Sony on the left. And we're going to zoom in on this so you can take a little bit better look, especially over the internet. What's important here is how it's reproducing this detail. So one of the reasons you've heard so much discussion is, oh, is the DLP really 4K? And how does it compare really to a 4K? And it's all been subjective. This is not subjective. You are seeing they're both reproducing the horizontal vertical, and they're both reproducing the 1 pixel crosshatch pattern here. They're both being able to reproduce the horizontal resolution as well as down here the vertical resolution in the crosshatch. So I think you can see that the critical ones to the eye, most of the eye is not going to be seeing this fine pattern at viewing distance, but you are going to be seeing this, and particularly this one at viewing distance. You can see which viewing distance for 4K optimum is 1.5 times the height of the screen to really get the full effect of 4K, and it's very, very visible at that difference. So this is one of the reasons we'll take a look at one other test pattern. So this is the last test signal that we're going to look at, and this one's actually being generated by a test signal generator, not a pattern on a PC, which we were looking at before. This is a true 4K test signal generator. This is called sweep, and as the frequencies get higher, the black and the white get finer and finer. And as you increase frequency, the transition between the black and the white generally has a roll-off, and that's what we're looking at in this part of the image is the difference. The part that the eye is really going to see at viewing distance is right here, these two. This is the Sony, this is the Optoma, and they're both very, very close to the same levels. We're getting a little bit of a color moire, which is present live. We don't know exactly what that is. It could be part of their optical system, but we've seen it on both of we've seen it on all of the 4K Sony projectors, and then this is the highest frequency here, and there actually is more detail at the highest frequency. You can definitely tell up this close that there is black and white information that is more distinct than what we're seeing here. But the reason we're not seeing that in any of the reviews, or you're not hearing anyone criticize the detail of this new DLP chip, is because this is what your eye is going to see here and here. So yes, there is a difference between true 4K which is 4096, and UHD, which is here, but at viewing distance, that's going to be a very tough call to say one's better than the other, because as you can see, they're very, very different. Okay, this is the last scene we'll look at in terms of detail and sharpness. Again, Sony has made an improvement in their lenses, and it's very visible to us. On a scene like this, we've frozen this scene. We're going to let it roll here in just a minute, but we wanted you to see as we zoom in here, particularly take a look at the fine detail here. You can see the text is almost readable here. And again, this is absolutely amazing how close these are considering the different technology and how they're able to reproduce these 8 million pixels. So we're going to put this is going to be put into play now, so we should be able to see some motion. and you get an idea of some of the differences in the actual detail that we're seeing, which is really very, very minimal. I think you'll see more differences in the color than you will in detail, which has surprised many reviewers. We're not a lab, we're not reviewing these projectors, we're merely doing some comparisons. We set them up as close as we can with calibration so that what you're seeing, as you can see this time we've reversed the Sony on the left so that you can get an idea of looking in the zoom in on the internet of how much detail each one of these projectors is reproducing. I'm going to freeze it here, and I'm hoping, are you able to see this one here?
Yep.
Okay, good. These two domes are absolutely amazingly detailed in 4K, as well as the hillside and the detail in the background. So in conclusion, we always get the question, so which one is the better projector? Every projector has its strengths and its weaknesses. And in this case, it really does come down to personal taste and preference. The Sony is actually higher resolution, but in terms of sharpness and detail on the screen on a 4K UHD movie, that is not going to be the issue in our opinion. They're very, very, very close in terms of UHD resolution. Contrast-wise, with an actual scene, again, they're very, very close, but the Sony has a level of sophistication. You can fine-tune the iris. You have the lens memory, so if you're going to do a 235 screen along with a 16:9 screen, that lens memory is invaluable. The Sony 285 does not give you quite the black levels, but in every other way is very comparable to the projector and the comparisons we've done here. And as you saw, we can adjust the iris so that essentially turn it off so you can see the difference in the black levels, which is real and significant.